We believe that to disappear, someone has to leave. They have to run away, be taken, or vanish into some dark, distant corner of the world. We imagine movement, distance, escape. What we almost never imagine is this: that a person can disappear without ever leaving the one place they were supposed to be, that they can vanish while remaining physically present, hidden just above, below, or behind the ordinary spaces we trust every single day. This story begins with that uncomfortable truth. Because what you are about to hear is not about a man who fled or a man who chose to be alone. It's about how easily our reality can collapse when routine replaces awareness. It's about how silence grows louder the longer it's ignored. And it's about how the most disturbing discoveries aren't found in some remote wilderness, but buried inside environments we assume are completely controlled, supervised, and secure. Hospitals are designed to represent order. They run on schedules, protocols, paperwork, and oversight. Every patient is registered, every movement is logged, every room is numbered. Every hallway is watched. Or at least, that's what we're told to believe. When someone enters a hospital, we trust that they are seen. We trust that someone is paying attention. When Sandile arrived at Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Hospital in Durban, he entered a system that sees thousands of people pass through its doors every week. He registered his name. He waited in the sitting area with everyone else. Time stretched on. The way it always does in hospitals. The minutes felt longer. The pain became heavier. Eventually, his name was called. Doctors examined him. An X-ray confirmed what his body already knew. His femur was broken. It was a serious injury. Hugh would need proper treatment and likely a transfer to another facility with orthopedic specialists. The plan was straightforward. He would stay overnight and then be moved once all the arrangements were complete. Sandile accepted this. He had no reason not to. He was placed in a room. He rested. He waited. And then, at some point between being told to stay and being prepared for that transfer, Sandile disappeared. When hospital staff returned with his paperwork, the room was empty. The bed was untouched. His belongings were gone. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No blood. No strange sounds reported by nearby patients. Nothing that suggested panic or an escape. At first, confusion overshadowed any real concern. Hospitals are complex places. Patients get moved around all the time. Miscommunication happens. Staff assumed someone else must have relocated him. They checked the records. Nothing. They asked other departments. The idea that Sandile had simply walked out on his own made no sense. His injury made any movement slow and painful. The hospital had security guards stationed throughout the building. entrances and exits were monitored. And yet, there was no record of him leaving. No camera footage, no logbook entry, nothing. The police were contacted, and a missing person case was opened. Investigators were faced with an impossible question. The odor intensified, spreading through entire sections of the building. Staff traced it slowly, reluctantly, to a storage area. A place that was rarely visited. A place that was assumed to be empty. Above that room, ceiling panels concealed a narrow maintenance space. When those tiles were finally removed and a light was shined into the darkness, reality shattered. Sandile Sabia had never left the hospital, whose body was found decomposing above the ceiling, hidden in a space accessible only to staff. A space no patient should have ever been able to reach, especially not a patient with a broken femur. There were no clear answers. No explanation for how he got up there. There was no ladder nearby. No evidence that someone had helped him. No timeline of events that made any sense. The hospital insisted that its security protocols were intact. Authorities promised there would be accountability if any wrongdoing was found. But a full, satisfying explanation never emerged. Sandile disappeared without leaving. He was missing while being present the entire time, and for days, people walked right beneath him, completely unaware. This is where the story becomes more than just a single tragedy. Because the most disturbing part isn't just that Sandile died. It's that the systems designed to protect him failed so completely that his absence went unnoticed while his body remained inside the building. It forces us to ask a question we rarely want to confront. If this could happen here, in a place built on the promise of care and observation, where else could it happen? This wasn't an abandoned building. It wasn't a forgotten place. It was a functioning hospital, a place built on the assumption that someone is always watching. And yet, no one looked up. This was only the beginning. Because Sandile was not the only person who disappeared without leaving. In our next part, the story moves away from institutions and into something far more familiar. A quiet neighborhood. A private home. A place where absence should have been obvious from the very first day. And still, no one saw it coming. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. It's easy to think someone could vanish from a big, impersonal place like a hospital. You can blame the system, the bureaucracy. It feels distant, clinical. But what happens when someone disappears from their own home? A place that's supposed to be the exact opposite of an institution. A home is all about routine, memory, and presence. It's not a system. It's a part of you. When someone has lived in the same spot for years, their absence should be a blaring alarm. Neighbors notice. Family notices. The silence becomes impossible to ignore. Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. Brian Egg lived in San Francisco, in a neighborhood where people knew each other. They knew his face, his habits, his daily rhythm. He wasn't a recluse or someone who kept to himself. He was part of the community. He talked to his family all the time. He answered his phone. He had routines that tied him to the world around him. Brian had spent most of his life in the city. He'd worked different jobs, even behind the bar at a popular local spot. He wasn't rich, but he was getting by. His home was modest, but it was his sanctuary. And most importantly, he was always there. So when the silence began, it just felt wrong. At first, it was subtle, a missed call, a delayed text. Things you can easily explain away. Life gets busy, right? People miss calls. Days slip by. He'd greet neighbors on the street. He'd clean up the alleyways near his house. He moved through his neighborhood with a sense of ownership and familiarity. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Days passed, and there was no sign of him. Then weeks. Soon, strangers began coming and going from Brian's house. Men that nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen before. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't make eye contact or interact with anyone. They just entered and exited his home as if they owned the place. Concern started to build. Neighbors began talking to each other, and they contacted the police. Officers came by. They knocked on the door, but nobody answered. There were no signs of a break-in, no obvious signs of an emergency. From the outside, the house just looked quiet, maybe a little neglected, but occupied. So the police made an assumption. Brian must be away. He must have gone somewhere. This single assumption would end up costing him everything. Weeks bled into months. The strangers continued their strange comings and goings. The silence from Brian deepened, too. And then, something happened that no one could ignore. Neighbors noticed soap suds seeping out from under Brian's front door. And not just a little bit. It was an excessive amount, enough to pool on the front step and spread. It looked like someone was doing some aggressive, frantic cleaning. Shortly after that, the overwhelming smell of bleach filled the air around the house. The walls were repainted. Parts of the door were altered, too. It looked less like home maintenance and more like a deliberate act of erasure. Still, nothing happened. The police had already checked. A conclusion had already been drawn. Brian wasn't home. There was no emergency. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it. People kept talking. They shared their growing concerns. They posted online. They reached out directly to Brian's family. Slowly but surely, the pressure started to build. Their calls to the police increased, and this time, they couldn't be ignored. When officers finally returned to conduct a full, proper search of the house, they were not prepared for what they were about to find. Inside the house, hidden beneath a staircase, there was a small, cramped storage space. The kind of place you'd easily overlook, meant for forgotten boxes and old belongings. Inside that tiny space was a fish tank. Ahead. And inside that fish tank was what was left of Brian Egg. His body had been dismembered. His head and hands were missing. His torso had been submerged in chemicals, a gruesome attempt to slow down decomposition. All of this had happened while strangers were living in his home, answering his phone, and using his belongings. Brian hadn't left. He had been there the entire time. Arrests were made. Charges were announced: homicide, identity theft, financial crimes. For a brief moment, it looked like justice was on the horizon. But then, the entire case began to unravel. Charges were dropped. Key evidence was deemed insufficient. The suspects were released. One of them was briefly held for unrelated reasons, but then he too was freed. To this day, no one has ever been convicted for the murder of Brian Egg. His death remains unresolved. 2. What makes this story so unbearable isn't just the horrific violence, it's the delay, the hesitation, the assumptions. It's the fact that there were so many warning signs. All of them visible, all of them reported, and yet they were all dismissed. The system didn't fail with a loud crash. It failed with a quiet whisper. And this is where we start to see a pattern emerging. In the hospital case we talked about before, the staff trusted their procedures more than their instincts. In Brian's neighborhood, the police trusted their assumptions more than the community's concern. In both scenarios, the environment itself created a false sense of security. Hospitals feel monitored. Homes feel personal. But both rely on the same fragile human element: attention. When attention fades, silence takes over. And silence creates space. Space for harm. Space for someone to disappear. The most unsettling realization is this: in both of these cases, the people didn't just vanish into the unknown. They vanished into neglect. They vanished because we stopped paying attention. 2. And in the next part of this series, the scale of that silence, that neglect, grows even larger. Because this story doesn't end with individuals disappearing while we look the other way. It expands into something far more disturbing: an entire family. Hidden. For years, in a place that everyone passed by every single day, and no one ever questioned it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. Our third story begins in a place where nothing ever seems to change. A quiet rural town where days pass slowly, where fields stretch farther than roads, and where familiarity breeds a deep sense of comfort. In places like this, people believe they know what's happening around them. They believe that secrets can't survive for long. That anything unusual would be noticed, talked about, questioned. But this belief is exactly what allowed an entire family to disappear in plain sight. Ruinerwold is not a place where strangers can easily blend in. It's quiet, predictable, the kind of town where a new face becomes an instant topic of conversation. For years, life there followed the same familiar rhythms. Farmers worked their land, shops opened and closed at the same hours, and people passed the same buildings every day without giving them a second thought. One of those buildings was a farmhouse, set back from the main road. It was isolated enough to feel private, but not so distant that it seemed suspicious. It had been there for years. People assumed someone lived there. Or maybe no one did. In towns like Ruinerwold, assumptions often take the place of certainty. They fill the quiet spaces. But inside that farmhouse, time had stopped. For years, children lived in silence. Not silence as a choice, but silence as a rule. They were taught that the outside world was dangerous, that society had already collapsed, and that leaving the farm meant certain death, too. They were raised without school, without doctors, without any normal human contact. They learned to lie about their ages. They learned to obey without question. They learned that fear was safety. No one knew this was happening. Or rather, no one suspected it strongly enough to actually look closer. The entire story only came to light because one person finally broke. A young man walked into a local cafe late one evening. He immediately looked out of place, who was thin, nervous, and his eyes struggled to meet anyone else's. At first, the staff just assumed he was another traveler passing through. But something about him felt wrong. Not dangerous, but fragile. Hollered. He ordered several beers and drank them quickly, as if his body didn't know how to slow down. The staff watched him carefully. He stayed. He lingered. He seemed like he wanted to speak, but just couldn't find the words. The next night, he returned. This time, the tension was impossible to ignore. The staff tried to engage him in a simple conversation, asking where he was from, why he was in town. His answers were hesitant, fragmented, as if he was translating his thoughts into a foreign language for the first time. Then, without any warning, he said something that changed everything. He said he hadn't been outside for years. Not days, not months. Years. He said he had grown up hidden away. That he had siblings still inside the farmhouse. That they were all waiting. That he couldn't leave them there anymore. The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded desperate. At first, the staff didn't know what to do. Claims like that don't fit neatly into reality. They sound exaggerated, maybe even delusional. But fear has a way of revealing itself through a person's behavior, and this young man was terrified. The cafe owner made a decision that most people never think they'll have to make. He called the police. Authorities arrived the next day. They went to the farmhouse. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. Old, quiet, ordinary. The kind of place you could drive past every single day without even noticing it was there. Inside, everything changed. They found hidden rooms, makeshift living spaces, and evidence of long-term, extreme isolation. And then, they found the people, the children. Not visitors, not guests. Residents. They claimed to be adults at first, insisting they were all over 18. They said they were fine. But their bodies told a different story. Their behavior told a different story. Their fear told the truth long before their words ever could. Investigators soon realized the lie had been taught to them. The children were not adults. They were minors. They had been hidden for most of their lives. Some of them had never existed in any official records. No school enrollment, no medical history, no documentation at all. As far as society was concerned, they had never even been born. The farmhouse had become their entire world. The outside world had become a myth. The man responsible was identified as their father. He had created a belief system built on isolation, fear, and absolute control. Another man had assisted him, too. Together, they convinced these children that society had ended, that leaving the farm would be fatal, and that their only hope for survival was complete obedience. Punishment was used to enforce this belief. Prayer was used as a form of discipline. Food was withheld as a method of correction. Physical suffering was justified as a means of purification. Holiday. Diaries that were later discovered revealed a horrifying pattern of control that blurred the line between ideology and pure cruelty. What makes this case so unbearable is not only the abuse itself, but the duration. Years passed. Seasons changed. People drove by that farmhouse day after day without suspecting a thing. No cries for help were ever heard. No one ever knocked on the door. 2. No one asked any questions. The children didn't disappear by accident. They disappeared by design. And once again, silence played its part perfectly. Neighbors just assumed someone else knew what was going on. Authorities had no reason to investigate. The environment itself, The rural distance, the value of privacy, the power of assumption discourage curiosity. We see the same pattern repeating. In the hospital, trust replaced awareness. In the neighborhood, assumptions replaced concern. And here, in the countryside, isolation replaced accountability. Different settings, same result. People vanished without ever leaving. The young man who escaped didn't just walk into a cafe, he walked into reality itself. A reality his siblings had never known. He carried the weight of guilt, fear, and responsibility all at once. He hadn't escaped for himself alone. He escaped to expose what had been hidden for so long. Authorities removed the children from the farmhouse. Medical evaluations began. Legal processes followed. But no intervention, no matter how thorough, can ever return stolen years. The world moved on. The farmhouse became a crime scene. And the town was left with a question that would never fully fade. How could this happen here? That question leads to an even more disturbing realization. These cases are not anomalies. They are warnings. Because the common thread connecting them is not cruelty alone. It's invisibility. It's what happens when our systems assume safety instead of verifying it. When communities trust familiarity instead of questioning it. When silence is mistaken for normalcy. In the next part, all of these stories converge. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And the most unsettling truth is this. These people didn't vanish into darkness. They vanished into everyday life. And that is where the real danger lives. Once these stories are placed side by side, something uncomfortable begins to take shape. At first, they appear separate. A hospital in South Africa, a home in San Francisco, a farmhouse in the Netherlands. Different countries, different cultures, different circumstances. But when the noise of location fades, the structure underneath is the same. In every case, the disappearance did not happen in chaos. It happened in order, in routine, in places where people believed someone else was responsible for watching. That belief is where the danger lives. In the hospital, responsibility was divided into departments, shifts, protocols, and paperwork. Everyone assumed someone else had eyes on the situation. Nurses trusted records. Security trusted procedures. Administrators trusted systems. And because everyone trusted something abstract, no one truly watched a human being. Sandile did not vanish in a moment of panic. He vanished in the gaps between responsibility, in the silent spaces where accountability dissolves. In Brian's neighborhood, the same fracture appeared in a different form. Neighbors noticed something was wrong, but police had already checked. Police checked, but no one answered the door. No answer became an assumption. An assumption became a conclusion. And a conclusion became permission to stop looking. The home felt occupied. The door was closed. Life seemed to continue. That illusion was enough. In Runeworld, the mechanism was even quieter. Isolation created invisibility. Distance created excuses. Privacy became protection for abuse. People assumed that rural life meant independence, not imprisonment. The absence of noise was mistaken for peace. This is how disappearance truly works. Not through sudden violence alone, but through gradual withdrawal from attention. The most disturbing part is not that people can do horrific things. It is that those things can persist for years without resistance, when no one interrupts the silence. And here is the moment where the story turns inward. Because these cases force a question that is difficult to sit with. What would you have done? You have noticed the missing patient, the unanswered calls, the strangers in the house, the isolated farm. Or would you have trusted that someone else was handling it? Most people do not ignore danger because they are cruel. They ignore it because it is uncomfortable, because questioning reality threatens stability, because assuming normalcy is easier than confronting the possibility of horror. Psychologically, the mind resists disruption. When something feels wrong but not urgent, the brain looks for explanations that preserve calm. He must be away. Someone else knows. It is not my place. I might be wrong. These thoughts feel reasonable. They feel safe. They are also lethal. The human brain is wired to defer responsibility when authority is present. In hospitals, authority is institutional. In neighborhoods, authority is law enforcement. In families, authority is parental. When authority exists, individuals step back, and that step back creates space. Space where suffering becomes invisible. In all three stories, the victims were present the entire time. They were not hidden in distant places. They were not unreachable. They were within walls, ceilings, and rooms that people passed every day. This is where the emotional weight peaks. Because once you understand this pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore its implications. It means that disappearance is not always an event. Sometimes it is a process. A slow fading from attention. A gradual erasure. A quiet agreement between people and systems to stop asking questions. And here is the hardest truth. These stories only came to light because something broke the silence. A smell became unbearable. A neighbor refused to stop calling. A young man walked into a cafe and spoke. Without those disruptions, these disappearances might never have been discovered. Sandile might have remained above the ceiling indefinitely. Brian's death might have been erased completely. Those children might have grown into adulthood believing the world had ended. This is the moment where realization hits. If this message is reaching you now, it is because silence was interrupted. And if this story affected you, if it made you uneasy, if it made you reflect on moments you ignored or questions you did not ask, then stay with this channel. Subscribe. Not for the stories alone, but for awareness. Because attention is not passive. It is an action. An action is what breaks silence. These stories are not meant to shock you for a moment and be forgotten. They are meant to change how you see ordinary spaces. Hospitals, homes, quiet roads, closed doors. Because horror does not always hide in darkness. Sometimes it hides in routine. And the only thing it needs to survive is for everyone to look away. The final part. We confront the question that remains after all the facts are known. After the cases are closed or left unresolved. After the victims are named and the stories are told. What responsibility does awareness place on us? And what happens if we ignore it? Then, when the facts are laid out and the details are known, there is a temptation to distance ourselves from these stories. To treat them as rare anomalies. To tell ourselves that they belong to another place, another system, another kind of person. It is comforting to believe that what happened to Sandile, to Brian, to those children, could never happen around us. Comforting, but false. Fit. Because the final truth these stories reveal is not about locations or villains. It is about human behavior. About how ordinary people respond to uncertainty. What remains is a quiet responsibility that does not disappear with the victims. Awareness changes nothing if it does not alter behavior. Knowing these stories means carrying them forward into how we move through the world. Consider how many moments in life feel slightly wrong but are dismissed. A door that never opens. A neighbor who vanishes from routine. A place that looks occupied but feels empty. A situation that raises questions we choose not to ask because asking would require involvement. Silence thrives on that hesitation. Fear. In the hospital, people trusted the system more than their instincts. In the neighborhood, authority was trusted more than concern. And comfort is dangerous, because comfort discourages interruption. It tells us that stability is more important than inquiry. That doubt is disruptive. That questioning is intrusive. And yet, every story you have heard exists because no one disrupted anything soon enough. Fear. This is the weight these stories leave behind. They ask us to reconsider what responsibility actually means. Responsibility is not only action when danger is obvious. It is attention when danger is quiet. It is persistence when explanations feel incomplete. It is the willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of someone else's safety. The people in these stories did not need heroes. They needed witnesses. Someone willing to say, "This does not feel right," and refuse to let that feeling go. When silence is allowed to settle, it becomes structure. When structure forms around silence, disappearance becomes possible. Not because no one cared, but because caring was deferred. And that is the most unsettling realization of all. These tragedies were not inevitable. They were enabled. Be able by assumptions, enabled by routines, enabled by the belief that someone else was paying attention. If there is a final lesson here, it is this. Pay attention to what feels absent. Absence is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smells. Suds. It looks like a closed door that stays closed too long. Sim. It looks like a system that works perfectly until it does not. The world does not need more fear. It needs more awareness. The kind that notices patterns. The kind that questions conclusions. The kind that refuses to accept silence as an answer. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think differently about the spaces you move through every day, then continue this journey. There are more stories like this. Not to terrify, but to remind. Not to accuse, but to awaken. Watch another story. Stay curious. Stay aware. Be. Because the most dangerous words are not, "Nothing is wrong." They are, "Someone else will handle it." And the moment we believe that, silence begins its work all over again.